Qatar has signed an agreement with U.S. aerospace firm Boeing to purchase some $200 billion worth of jets. The agreement is for 160 aircraft, making it the largest such order in the U.S. corporation's history. It was one of several agreements signed by U.S. President Donald Trump and Qatar's Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani in Doha. The U.S. president is in Qatar as part of a 4-day Middle East trip aimed at boosting investment in the United States. Journalist Karim El-Gawari is following Trump's visit from the Egyptian capital, Cairo. Karim, good to see you again. Now, apart from the Boeing deal, there was also a major security agreement signed between the U.S. and Qatar. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there was a public part and there was a hidden part behind closed doors. Of course, the only thing we know is the public part, the signing of prepared contracts. You already mentioned the biggest in the history of the company of Boeing. 160 airplanes were ordered for $200 billion. Also, there was a defense cooperation contract and several arm purchases. Mind you that in Qatar is already the biggest U.S. airbase in the entire region. Now, I think what's probably more important is what probably happened behind closed doors. And that was not pre-choreographed. And that, I think, was mainly about politics, about Iran, about Gaza, and about Ukraine. All three issues where Doha or Qatar is playing a mediator. Hardly anything is known now what happened behind these meetings behind closed doors between both leaders. But there is a sense that something is cooking there, because important also present was Steve Witkoff, that's Trump's U.S. envoy for mediating all kinds of issues from Gaza, Ukraine, and Iran. He's the main negotiator. So journalists afterwards went up to him and were asking him, and he was very positive about Ukraine and Gaza. He was saying, we are making progress, asking, then somebody asked him if the progress in Gaza was on a ceasefire or on getting finally aid in. He said that there's progress on all fronts, but of course, yet nothing concrete in public.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about something else, because yesterday back in Saudi Arabia still, Trump announced he would lift sanctions on Syria. That decision was celebrated in the streets of Damascus. Let's take a look.
Celebrations on the streets of Damascus. Syrians here hopeful that lifting U.S. sanctions will help revive their country's economy.
We're hopeful that the sanctions will be lifted, and we hope for new investments to return to Syria and for the economy to pick up again. A lot of companies boycotted us because of the despicable Bashar, and everything was forbidden. Investment was forbidden. The economy was forbidden.
This is a second liberation. The sanctions will be lifted, which means a revival is coming. We will no longer have crises, no more water crises, no more economic crises.
Washington originally designated Syria a state sponsor of terrorism back in 1979. That led to an arms embargo and financial restrictions. More sanctions were imposed in 2004, including further restrictions on arms exports. But the most sweeping sanctions on Syria came during the war. Cutting Syria out of the international banking system, blocking money transfers, restricting imports, and banning investments. Along with the war, the sanctions decimated Syria's economy. Now, there is hope for what Trump calls a fresh start.
It's important for us to see relief on sanctions on Syria, to help the reconstruction of Syria, to help the Syrian people recover from more than a decade of conflict, a decade of underinvestment.
The U.S. had previously offered a $10 million reward for the capture of Syria's current leader, al-Shara. A terrorist designation was placed on the group he led, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, due to its past links with al-Qaeda. This was one of the reasons there has been international wariness to remove sanctions on Syria, even after the fall of al-Assad. But Shara has gradually gained international legitimacy for his government since it came to power in December. The U.S. removed the reward, and he's been able to travel and meet world leaders.
Karim, so Trump promises a fresh start or the possibility of a fresh start for Syria. What do you think the lifting of the sanctions means for the country?
Well, I myself was in Syria since the downfall of Bashar al-Assad several times. It is extremely important because people, what they need most is an improvement of their life. During the war and through the sanctions, the economy in Syria shrunk by 90%. And if you're now today in Syria, you can see like for the basic things to shop, when you go to a supermarket or anything, people have bags of money with them in order to do their basic shoppings. There is no proper banking system, for example. Of course, we know there are many Syrians living abroad, but it's very difficult to send money home back to their family, and it's virtually impossible through the banking system. So lifting the sanction will for sure have a big impact on the daily life of people, although probably not expecting that this improvement is just happening overnight. But you can see with the celebrations that are happening all over the country since yesterday that people have a lot of hope in this lifting of sanctions.
Yeah. On the Strip, Karim, Trump has been touting his friendship with Gulf leaders, but does his visit also mark a shift in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I don't think a basic shift. U.S. and Trump always had a strong relationship with the Gulf states and with their leaders. He knows them since many years. He always sees, of course, the Gulf as an opportunity to make money. And at the same time, of course, the U.S. remains to be, for example, the main ally and the biggest arms supplier of Israel. So, but that is not going to change. But I think what Trump is experiencing on this trip, also especially now, is that he is seeing that the Israeli offensive in Gaza he will see this more and more as a burden also in his relationship with the Arab world. Signs are that he wants to see an end of the war, and with that he will be at odds with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who wants to expand the war now. That makes, of course, Netanyahu and the right-wing government in Israel extremely nervous right now. What's going to happen? And they also see themselves standing somehow on the sideline. But I would describe it as a basic shift.
That's journalist Karim El-Gawari from Cairo. Thank you. Always great speaking to you, Karim.
You're welcome.
And Kate Ferguson from DW Business has more on investments and economic ties between the U.S. and Gulf states. Kate, welcome. What's the significance, you think, of Trump deepening economic ties with Gulf states on this visit?
Well, if we look at the kinds of deals that have been struck on this trip, they're mainly in two areas, artificial intelligence and defense, the two sectors that are most going to define geopolitical power in the future. So just to give you a couple of examples, we have a $142 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Then in the area of artificial intelligence, you've got American chipmaker NVIDIA agreeing to sell some really high-end chip technology to Saudi Arabia, as well as Qualcomm committing to building a data center in Saudi Arabia. If you consider how much America has invested in denying China access to this kind of technology, you can see just what a sign of trust this is. And I think Gulf leaders have a very intuitive understanding of how Trump works, and they're using that to their advantage. There's no way that Qatar would have gifted any other American president a luxury jet, for example.
And what do Gulf countries stand to gain from these investments that are coming from America?
Well, they really need to diversify their economies away from oil, because while it has brought them great wealth over the past few decades, it's also led to a degree of complacency in that they haven't been focusing on other areas of growth. And in the past few years, that has been changing. They've been looking at investing in things like tourism, healthcare, and green technology. And in that context, investing in AI, becoming leaders in this very future-oriented industry, is a smart move. But there are questions over the feasibility of these investments because of their size. Saudi Arabia has now committed 12% of its GDP to America. And given that oil prices, which they still rely on, are very volatile, this is actually quite risky.
So where does that leave us about when it comes to the question of the future of global trade?
So I think what this really signals is that the economic order that was established after World War II really has come to an end. Because traditionally, America's most important allies have been liberal democracies. Now they are authoritarian regimes where the personal and the political are often blended together. And we see this in the Gulf region, where Trump's family's business really is literally etched into the landscape. They have hotels and golf courses across the Gulf region. And even Syria, in pitching investment to the United States, didn't just offer access to its oil and gas. It also suggested that they build a Trump Tower in Damascus. And these things are one area. But if you look at AI and defense, these are strategic sectors. And these deals will outlast the Trump presidency. So I think for America's allies, it's really time for them to realize that the order is changing and perhaps they need to seek deeper alliances of their own elsewhere.
Kate Ferguson, thanks very much for that detailed breakdown. And let's bring in DW Beirut Bureau Chief Mohammad Shraite for more. Mohammad, how big of a step is this for Syria's new administration?
This marks a new chapter for Syria and a new chapter for the relations between the country and the United States, especially following Trump's surprising announcement yesterday of an end to U.S. sanctions on Syria. This, of course, has great impact on the war-torn country as it paves the way for investment and aid much needed for the reconstruction, but also paves the way for other countries to establish and re-establish diplomatic and economic ties with Syria. This is a major boost for the Syrian leadership and for the Syrian people. In fact, we've seen crowds taking the streets yesterday in celebration of this decision in Damascus. But this is not a blank check that Trump gave to al-Shara. We're reading that Trump had asked al-Shara to help in the fight against terrorism, and namely ISIS, and to deport members of the Palestinian factions, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad from Syria, and to join the Abraham Accord, leading to normalizing ties with Israel. Now, al-Shara and his government have been sending cooperative signals towards that after announcing that it is engaging in indirect talks with Israel through the United Arab Emirates.
And Turkish President Erdogan joined the meeting between Trump, Shara and Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman remotely. What is Turkey's role here?
So President Erdogan had already asked Trump to consider lifting sanctions imposed on Syria. Turkey, we know that Turkey has played a key role in the country, in Syria, for over a decade by supporting the Syrian opposition. And this role has been further growing since the fall of the Assad regime in last December. Now, according to the Turkish presidency, President Erdogan in this meeting once again assured his support for the Syrian authorities, for the new Syrian authorities, and said that a stable Syria is a key for regional stability, so that Syria does not represent a threat to its neighbors.
Now, Trump also talked about Lebanon, saying, quote, "There is a new chance in Lebanon with its new president and prime minister." What did he mean?
Well, basically, Trump mentioning a new chance in Lebanon is signaling the shift of power in the country after Hezbollah lost grip due to the big blow it received during the war with Israel. But this is really an indication of the wider picture that is being worked in the Middle East. Trump's visit is widely seen here in the region as a moment when Arabs and Turkey are closer to the US, maybe even closer than Israel to the United States. And this has established a strategic path of relationship that could be shaping a new Middle East. The question is whether this path will continue or will it face obstacles.
DW's Beirut Bureau Chief Mohammad Shraite, thanks so much.